So, ladies and gentlemen, if you please take your seat. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this Council Planning Committee, the Ides of March. Hopefully no one's going to be assassinated, but you never know. A few housekeeping remarks. There is no fire drill scheduled this evening, so if the fire alarm goes off, we will have to assume that it is, in fact, a fire. Democratic Services officers will find a way out and hopefully return to tell us what it is. Right. Secondly, we have our own webcasting service, well, most of the time anyway. Can I ask if anyone else is intending to record the meeting? That's not to stop anyone, that's just so we know it's happening. No? In that case, I shall move on with the agenda. Item 1, apologies for absence. Any apologies, Mrs. Smith?
We've received apologies from Councillors Borton, Clark, Powell and Prendergast.
Thank you very much indeed. Substitute members, please. Councillor Perry.
Councillor Perry for, Councillor Perry for Councillor President.
Thank you. Any others? No. Notification of visiting members. Councillor Garton. Councillor Garton? What item are you here for? Thank you very much. It won't be the second one, it will be the first one. I intend to vary the order of the meeting and take you first, as I know you have to leave early. Right. Items withdrawn from the agenda. At the moment, there aren't any. Right. Moving on to date of adjourned meeting. We will not be having an adjourned meeting unless something seriously goes wrong. But if it does, it's the 22nd of March. Item 6, any business the Chairman regards as urgent, including the urgent update report, as it refers to matters to be considered at this meeting. We have a rather short urgent update report, but we do have one. Item 7, disclosures by members and officers. Any disclosures? No. Moving rapidly onwards. Item 8, disclosures of lobbying. We will take with the particular items, so we don't forget, as I always do when we do it en bloc. Item 9, to consider whether any items should be taken in private because of the possible disclosure of exempt information. There are none. Item 10, minutes of the meeting of the 22nd of February 2018. Are there any corrections to these minutes? No, in that case, can we agree? Thank you. Item 11, presentation of petitions, if any. There are no petitions this evening. Item 12, deferred items, page 7 to 8. Is there any update on the deferred items, Mr. Bailey? Thank you very much indeed. Before we get into the meat of the applications this evening, may I introduce to you, those of you who have not met him already, our new star transfer from Sevenoaks Council, Mr. Aaron Hill, who is our major projects team leader. Major projects manager. I know, it's the same thing. And we now move on to the planning applications for this evening. As I said, we are varying the orders to benefit Councillor Garton and hopefully Mr. Crabtree. So we start with item 2, pages 16. Item 16, page 39.
Oh, you changed it?
Yes. Please, would you turn them up?
Thank you, Chair. This application is for the demolition of the existing farm buildings and the construction of a detached 5-bedroom house and detached garage on this rectangular-shaped site. The new living space is arranged over 3 levels, ground first and loft space. The site is in an area of outstanding natural beauty. The site is on Hazel Street, close to the junction with Southwest Lane. The application site is considered to be an open countryside located, it is an open countryside and opposite on the east side of Hazel Street. In terms of the photographs, this image has the existing site access on the left-hand side of the photograph. You can just about see the building on the extreme left. Just in the distance, on the right-hand side, is the junction of Southwest Lane. This is looking in the opposite direction, again with the site entrance on the right-hand side of the photograph, with the building visible. The field boundary on the right-hand side is with Willow Tree Barn. This is a further picture of the present building on the site. This is looking into the site from the entrance in Hazel Street. Second image of the existing building. This is from the side of the building, which is to the north. Note the very basic structure of the building, which officers think that can't actually be changed to residential use without major structural work. This is the back of the existing building, which is to the east. In terms of the aerial photograph, you've got Hazel Street running across the page, Southleys Lane running up the page. The application site is over to the left-hand side of the image. Then you've got Willow Tree Barn and Wheatsheaf Farm. In terms of the proposed site layout, again, you get Hazel Street running across the page. The new dwelling is located on the northern side of the site with a garage to the south. The proposal involves the relocation of the existing access, which is the sort of bottom right of this image. So the access is being relocated into the centre of the site, and also a new pedestrian access formed by holes through the existing hedge. In terms of the existing building, these two images of the south and north elevations note the open construction of the building at present. In terms of the proposed building, this is the front elevation. The building will be constructed in yellow stock facing brickwork, plain tile hanging at first floor level, plain tiles to the main roof, and painted softwood joinery. The rear elevation, and then the floor plans, ground floor, first floor with three bedrooms, further 2 bedrooms at second floor level. The site is located outside of any settlement boundary as defined in the adopted local plan. The site is considered to be in an unsustainable location, which is poorly related to basic services and transport. And as a result of that, future occupiers will be reliant on the private motor car. The proposal is therefore considered contrary to policy SS1 of the local plan and government guidance in paragraph 55 of the NPPF. The proposal will be harmful to the landscape character and scenic beauty of the Kent Downs AONB, contrary to the provisions set out in policy SP17 and DM30 of the local plan, and government guidance in paragraph 115 of the NPPF, which states that great weight should be given to the conservation of landscape and scenic beauty of the AONB. Note the extra representation in the urgent updates from the Kent Downs AONB unit, who raised objections on the grounds of the harmful impact of the proposed new house. The officer's recommendation is to refuse planning permission. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ryan. Before I proceed any further, I'll just ask the legal officer to outline how public speaking works this evening.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is a short announcement for members of the public, and in particular those who are speaking on an item this evening. As you've just heard, the item is announced by the chairman, and then the planning officer introduces the item. The chairman will then call the speakers. When you hear your name called, please could you come forward to the table in front of you and take a seat. To speak, press the middle button down. You do not need to hold it down. The button will turn green and the ring around the mouthpiece on the microphone will turn red. You will have 3 minutes to speak. We have a timer here and it will count down and the chairman will notify you when your 3 minutes are up. Once you've finished speaking, please press the middle button again. It will turn white and then return to your seat. You may hear some of the speakers referred to as visiting members. They are members of the council, but they don't sit on this committee. They also have 3 minutes to speak, but they have no right to vote on any of the applications. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will draw members' attention to the fact that there is an urgent update report, and I will also, at this stage, take any declarations of lobbying. Anyone been lobbied? Councillor Round, Councillor Perry and myself. Thank you. Right. Move on to our first speaker. Do I see Mr. Crabtree? No. It's in front of... Right. Mr. Crabtree, you have 3 minutes and starting whenever you're ready.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members. Thank you for listening to me this evening. I was going to start off by saying that of all the applications of which I've been a party to for the last 50 or so years, this is the first one that I've ever had that has absolutely no objections. Sadly, I see this evening, which is the first time I've seen this, a very late consultation coming from the AONB unit, which I would have thought was well after the end of the consultation period. Apart from that, I think my planning consultant also advises me that in law, this planning consent for the conversion of the building into holiday accommodation is in fact valid and is live and could be started at any time. So there's a disagreement on that. I wonder whether perhaps I could ask for the application to be deferred, perhaps until that legal situation is resolved. I think that's apart from that, that's really all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Crabtree, for your succinctness. It's always welcome. Councillor Garton.
Mr. Chairman, members, good evening. Outside the AONB, this proposal to convert an agricultural building to a residential one would most likely be granted under permitted development rights. So why are we seeking to preserve an ugly building in order to protect the AONB? I called in this application to the committee for you members to weigh up the detriment of it, which led the officer to recommend refusal, versus the benefit which the application may achieve by replacing a significantly larger, ugly agricultural building with a smaller dwelling which is designed in a manner that will contribute to the conservation and enhancement of the special characteristics of the AONB. The AONB is a living, working environment within which people conduct their lives. It's not a museum. The Kent Downs Management Plan aims to balance these conflicting aims to ensure that development is accommodated without harm to the overall quality of the environment. The replacement of an ugly barn by a traditionally designed smaller dwelling will reduce the overall impact on the surrounding countryside. The finished appearance will be that of an attractively designed traditional house that both complements the street scene in Hazel Street and that will result in a more traditional and enhanced visual contribution to the character and setting of the surrounding area to the benefit of the AONB. I've been there on a site visit myself. The building as it is, or as it is proposed, is only visible from the northern side. It's only visible for about 200 yards once you come up the lane. It's shielded in all other 3 directions. The neighbours in the hamlet are broadly in favour of this development. This is a small development where we are not setting a precedent. I'm very well aware of plans for the AONB, like Bimbury Lane, etc. There's some plans in for larger developments in the pipeline. This is not setting a precedent. This is only a small development. And also, I don't think that traffic is an issue. It has not been raised by KCC. We have traffic issues in the North Downs, but it is the through traffic, people trying to divert from the A249 if there are problems. 1 or 2 residential houses, in my view, are absolutely negligible. And very finally, beware, members, of unintended consequences. Despite the location being in the AONB, permitted development rights would still exist for business use. And who would like to see a motorbike repair shop in this pretty hamlet? And with that, I recommend my support for this application. Thank you, members.
Thank you very much, Councillor Garton. I don't see any members indicating... Oh, Councillor Round.
I think in fairness to the applicant, we can ask the officers for a consideration on his question, please. On the question that he raised, that there is...
Mr Bailey, on the question, or Mr Ryan, in relation to the question of a supposed lawful use that could be...
Members' attention is drawn to the bottom of the first page of the relevant update, which goes through in terms of what officers would actually consider the lawful start of that 91 plan application, i.e. You would need the physical work to be finished and the buildings to be occupied before that lawful fallback use was actually relevant.
Yes, you can, Mr.
And I think it's key that members need to consider this application. The applicant had the opportunity to establish the lawful commencement of that site. They obviously know the planning system. They can submit lawful development certificate if they so wish. Members are here to determine in application. Had they wanted to establish at that time a lawful use of that, they could have submitted a lawful development certificate. It's in the Town and Country Planning Act how you do that, and it shouldn't be used as a system to hold up making a decision, in my view, because the applicants had the perfect opportunity to do that before this has come forward. And we shouldn't hold an application pending receipt determination of that LDC, which may or may not prove on the balance of probability.
Additionally to that, I would, personally, I feel when you've got a situation, say, with holiday lets in wherever they are, AONB or wherever, you can end up quite often with a very strong tourism or economic development argument, even in quite scenic locations, which is completely different from possibly the argument for residential development. So having one does not necessarily imply that you should have the other. I'm not saying it implies the opposite either, but it doesn't necessarily imply that. So there we go. Anyone else wishing to? Councillor Perry, thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. When I read this, I have to say I was really quite puzzled, actually, because I couldn't figure out why I'd want to refuse it. It's only one house in a rather derelict site, it seems to me, and it seems to be actually an improvement. And I can think of And dare I say it, I think if this was a G&T site on the thing and a few bat boxes and hedges put up, everybody's saying all okay. Now, I know you're sort of slightly shocked when I said, but I just think there's a lack of consistency here. It talks about remoteness of the site, and yet there's another application coming in, which is actually equally remote, actually, and seems to be approved. So there's a complete lack of consistency. And I do think it's a bit of a sledgehammer to crack a nut. We're talking about one house. There's no objections from neighbours, from what I can see. And the arguments put forward for the recommendation, and one of the, it seems to boil down to whether you have to use a motor car. Well, there are a lot of sites where we do approve, where quite frankly you have to use a motor car. And if you've got a nice house in the middle of a country area, you're not going to wait for a bus anyway. You're going to be getting in your 4x4 and going shopping. So I don't really buy any of that. And the lack of sustainability, I just think it's fantasy land, quite frankly. And I think we ought to be a bit more realistic on what the real world is. So I'm very sympathetic to what I heard from Councillor Garden, actually. And I can't see what harm this is doing to the countryside at all. I know it's in a sensitive area, but no one else has objected to it. And I think we should be a little bit more realistic and apply a bit of old-fashioned common sense to this. This is just one house, and it sounds quite a nice house to me. So I'm not very happy about refusing it. Thank you, Chair.
I think if one is going to overturn an officer's recommendation in either direction, the current legal position is one has to give a reason. Now, it's not sufficient to say it's only one house or one pig farm or whatever. It's, there has to be a reason for saying that we are going to overturn the recommendation that amounts to a justification for overturning it. And simply saying it's one house in the is not good enough if it's in the AONB. I agree to an extent with what you're saying about the sustainability issue, Councillor Perry. We have not necessarily been consistent on that front. But here the main issue is landscape. There may be an argument, in fact I think quite sympathetic to the argument, that tourism sites can exist in the countryside in areas other what we would not necessarily grant residential development for, but we have got an application here which is not that, it's a residential development. And if we just say, well, it's one house or two houses or three houses, why don't we just abolish the OMB tomorrow and say, oh, it doesn't really matter if it's a nice house or a nice design? So I have to say that I'm going to propose the recommendation on the papers because it is in line with our policies, and to overturn it we need a very good reason. Is that seconded? Councillor Cox, if you wish to speak. And then I'm coming.
Thank you very much. I hear mention of consistency, and I do raise my eyebrows because it sort of goes one way and then we are inconsistent another way as well. On the unseen papers that we have here, the update, the first paragraph very clearly says, and I believe, if I'm wrong, then correct me, emphasising that the reasons why agricultural buildings do not benefit from permitted development. It's actually given to us here, so unless we're going to be told to discount what's in front of us, we have had a body say it doesn't comply, so therefore we have to listen to that body. That is what's being given to us, along with the officer's recommendation, and that's why I'm happy to second.
And I shall now move to Councillor Mrs Stockwell.
Sorry, Chairman, I think it's all been said. I quite agree with the last speaker, and I agree with the recommendation. If we can't protect our AONBs and our special landscape areas like that, you know, what are we doing here? And it says, it emphasises here that even agricultural buildings don't benefit from permitted development rights. And here we are saying, we'll have a big house. That will only spawn more domestic, there'll be domestic paraphernalia up there. You won't be able to avoid it. And, you know, frankly, I'm with the officer's recommendation on this completely.
Councillor Spooner, did I see you indicate or not? I'm not sure.
Yes, you did, yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, sorry.
Right, you can hear me now. Good. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I honestly think this site there is a fundamental planning policy objection to this site. It's in the AONB. It's in a highly unsustainable location. It's a tatty old farm building, but that is fairly typical of what one gets in rural areas. And I look at the picture there, and I think that is going to have it has far less impact on the landscape than what a new house would. Once it gets built, there was paraphernalia, its garden sheds, its greenhouses and everything else. I support the officers on this one. I think they got it spot on, and I'm happy to support the recommendation for refusal.
Thank you. Councillor Mumford, and you're the last speaker.
I'm on. We wrote the local plan and there are rules, and we've got to keep the integrity of our local plan. And to permit this, we trample over ANOB, village boundaries, SP17, I'm being told DM30, but I'm not quite sure I can see where we're going with that one. But to keep the integrity of what we voted through and what we debated, we've got to stand by it, even though we'd like not to. As for an ugly building, that looks like an old lambing shed to me. I don't find it ugly. I find it in situ where it should be.
Thank you, Councillor Mumford. I shall now move to the vote on the recommendation to approve, as per the papers and the urgent update. Sorry, approve the recommendation Sorry, I meant to approve the recommendation, not to approve the application. You're quite right. I shall reword that. To approve the recommendation to refuse. Thank you. Apologies. I could have worded that more clearly. Those in favour of the... Those against? Abstentions? Okay. For the information of the public, Councillor Harwood entered partway during this debate and under our procedures was excluded from taking part in the discussion and vote. It wasn't because he wasn't interested. We now move on to the next application, which is item 15, page 25. Bletchley Oast and Bletchley Farm Industrial Estate.
Thank you. This application for Bletchley Oast and Bletchley Farm is on a site which is in the open countryside, outside any urban or village boundary, and it's set 1.5 miles from the village of Staplehurst. The site provides a small enclave of buildings, including a 19th century oast house, a former barn and a stable block. The site also has various disused agricultural buildings and some modern units which are used for business use. There is also sort of large areas of concrete, hard standing on the site. In terms of the aerial photograph, you can see a large area of parking at the front of the site. The road runs along the top of this image. The site was originally part of a larger farm, but it's been separated from the main farmhouse, which is Bletchley Farm, which is a Grade 2 listed building, and it's 30 metres to the east of the site. Whilst not a designated employment site, the site does house 6 local businesses, including an MOT garage, radiator specialist and a business specialising in the restoration of classic cars and buses. In terms of the entrance to the site from the main road, this is looking south into the site with a large area of parking. You see the Oast in the background of this image. A photograph taken from within the site with evidence of the restoration use there, with existing buildings in the background. Again, the sort of present buildings on the site, these buildings are due to be restored as part of the application. The bar here, which is due to be removed, and note the hard standing area as well. In terms of the site, the proposed site layout, the proposal would provide 7 residential units, 2 of which are in the retained and converted buildings of the Oast House, which is, if you can just see it, the Oast House is 2 on this plan, with 1, the stable block also providing a unit. The proposal includes 5 new build units, which are along the sort of bottom and left-hand side of this plan, which include detached 4-bedroom units, a semi-detached 3-bedroom unit, and a further detached 4-bedroom unit. Just going through the elevations, this is existing and proposed of plot 1. You can see the sort of green roof barn would be removed, just flicking between the existing and proposed. In terms of the Oast House, again, structures added on to the original building would actually be removed, and renovation work carried out to the retained buildings. And again, the front and side elevations of the Oast House. In terms of the sort of new buildings, this is plot 3, which is a new build attached to 2-storey 4-bedroom unit. Plot 4, all the buildings of a similar style. This has a roof ridge height of just above 8 metres with eaves of 5 metres, pitched slate roof. These are the 2 semi-detached buildings with hipped end roofs and further living space within the loft space of the building. These would have a ridge height of 7.7 metres with eaves at 3 metres. And the last of the sort of new build units, plot 7, would have a ridge height of 8 metres with eaves at 5 metres. All the buildings use a red-brown facing brick with red feature brickwork, weathered slate roof covering, white weatherboarding, hanging tiles and stone window sills. The proposed development, which includes the conversion of the Oast House and stable block, is considered acceptable and in accordance with the local plan. The proposal is on brownfield land in a sustainable location close to Staplehurst Rural Service Centre, and as a result of this is in accordance with policy DM5. The proposal would not harm the setting of the nearby listed buildings, and the removal of the poor quality commercial buildings and open air bus storage and new landscape planting would result in significant visual enhancement of the site. In terms of the loss of the existing businesses on the site, there is no direct policy support for the retention of businesses in this location. As set out in the urgent update sheet, there are more suitable locations allocated and protected by the new local plan for the location of these businesses. council officers can offer assistance in the relocation of the existing businesses to these more suitable sites. The proposal is considered acceptable in relation to residential amenity, highway safety, landscape and ecological impact, and in these circumstances, a conditional approval is recommended. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ryan. First speaker this evening on this application is Mrs. Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Good evening. Thanks for listening. How to make the most of my 3 minutes, I don't know. I'm going to give it a go, but here it goes. I just want to read a couple of things that my husband and I had outlined in our letter that we sent to Maidstone Borough Council in November. And the first thing is that we believe this development is in direct contraindication to the principles set out in the Staplehurst Neighbourhood Plan, which was voted for by the local community in 2016. Namely, it disregards the identified aims of protecting the wider countryside, outside areas identified for new development. There is lots of new development going on in Staplehurst currently and in the future. It will prevent the unchecked spread of the village. It would also undermine the fact that existing businesses in the farmyard would either be forced out of the area or would have to shut down. And yet the stated objective that it creates a strong local economy with good access to jobs and employment opportunities is contraindicated. To approve this development would therefore be against the will of the entire local community and set a precedent that its wishes can be ignored with impunity. The addition of 26 permanently based domestic vehicles at this location would undoubtedly have a major impact, not just on the overall numbers of vehicles using the lane, but also the way and times at which the lane is used overall. The usage of new residents moving to the location would undoubtedly be different and probably greater than those of the small businesses presently trading from that area. Now, I've got to speak from my heart, really, because I'm not expert in this as you are. I live along Bristling Lane, and like many other residents, not just to Bristling Lane, but the whole area, I enjoy walking, running, dog walking, cycling. I even see young mums with pushchairs walking along that lane. I feel they do take their lives into their hands, but why shouldn't they be going out walking and feel safe? I have seen many near misses over the 14 years that we've lived there along that lane. And to finish with professionally, I've nursed for 35 years, and the bulk of that time has been in my specialisms of A&E and intensive care. Sadly, I've seen the absolute devastation and horror that road traffic accidents cause, many of which had occurred on roads with good visibility, straight roads. This is a single track lane in both directions. This development would be on a blind bend coming in from the right, and developers cannot get round that.
Okay, thank you. I have to bring you to a close at that point, as that's 3 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right. Before we proceed any further, the Councillor Buller of Staplehurst Parish Council was due to join us this evening. As you can see, very sadly, I'm sure our best wishes are with her. She was taken ill earlier today and consequently can't join us. So I'm sure we wish her a good recovery and hope it's nothing too serious. Those of you who were available on email during the day will have seen the statement of what she would have said that has been circulated. And I'm sure Councillor Perry will be returning to that subject in due course. But at this point, I'll now need to move on to Mr. Norton for the applicant. Thank you, Mr Milton. I draw members' attention to the fact that there is an urgent update report, and at this stage I will take declarations of lobbying. If anyone's been lobbied, Councillor Round, Councillor Perry, Councillor Harwood and myself. Anyone else? That seems to be everyone apart from Councillor Vizard. Have you been lobbied? No. And Mrs Stockwell? No? No. Yes, you said you've been lobbied, Councillor Mumford. And I said everyone except Councillor Vizard and Councillor Stockwell. Right, okay. Everyone except Councillor Vizard, for some reason. Perhaps they can't spell his version of Brian. Quite probably, actually. Councillor Perry, as you're one of the ward members for Staplehurst.
Yes, well, I just heard the word hard work in our village has suddenly been trumped. As an ex-diplomat, I find that use of language rather strange in a public forum. But anyways, I'll leave it at that. I'm slightly puzzled by this as well, actually. There was a planning application it's a long time ago now, I know, it's in 2000, which was refused. But this application is actually for even more houses than the original one that was refused. So I am slightly concerned on that. And the other thing, and I'm puzzled by, and the other thing I noticed that there was a development applied for on the Goudhurst Road, not so far from Pristling Lane, for converting an oast house, and I think it was a hop to do with the hop industry, and that was refused. And so I'm a bit puzzled as to why this one suddenly seems to tick all the boxes. So let me just go through some of the issues, I think. In my view, and this is something that Staplehurst Parish Council have said, that it does contravene PW2 of our neighbourhood plan. And with all due respect, our neighbourhood plan does have some weight. Mainly, principally, because it's outside the village envelope. And if you recall, a few council meetings ago, we refused a planning application because it was outside the planning envelope, and it was closer to the village than this. So we need a little bit of consistency here, in my view. Now, the online petition, 750 residents of my ward are not to be dismissed in the way they were so casually dismissed, and I formally object to what was said. This is a business operation. It has a number of small businesses, 6 businesses operating there, and that is of extreme importance to our village. I also would note that policy SSI in the local plan does make specific reference to suitably scaled employment opportunities. So I find it again puzzling that we have a proposal that possibly does away with that, and that is supported, which does seem to contravene the local plan. And I would, objective 12 of the neighbourhood plan, again, the neighbourhood plan, is very important in this respect because it highlights the support for a strong local economy with good access to jobs and employment opportunities. These are existing businesses, and I think this is incredibly important. And this again is reinforced by policy SP5 in the local plan, where in paragraph 2 it actually states retain and improve existing employment sites and encourage employment opportunities provided. It's not talking about doing away with sites, so this seems to be what this proposal would actually do. Now, there's another key point I really want to dwell on just a little bit, and that's the sustainability argument. And I notice the report is very light on the economic issues, and it's very light, actually, on the sustainability issues. Now, para 6.04 of the report, in my view, must be challenged. It is, quite frankly, I search for words here, but it is really not correct that this is a sustainable site. You will not be possible to walk from this site to a bus stop. Believe me, I know this site very well. I've tramped around there. I've delivered leaflets around there. So I know it really, really well. Pristling Lane is a windy road. It has no pavements, and at dark would be pretty lethal. You then go on to the Goudhurst Road, which is pretty quick, has no pavements, unlit, and if you really fancy walking down there to a bus in early evening, I doubt if you survive the journey, quite frankly. It is not sustainable. And then you go on to Pinnock Lane, and the part of Pinnock Lane you would go on to doesn't have any pavements either, and in fact cars struggle to either overtake or pass each other. So again, the sustainability argument, that this is a sustainable site, is really very, very, very weak. Now, we just, in fact, I think, refused a site where it's dependent on the car. Well, this would be dependent on the car. There is no other way. And I don't believe you'd want to risk cycling it either, quite frankly. It would be a big risk. You might, unless you put a headlight on your head and you put a high-vis jacket all over the place, I would not risk cycling. So this, if you're using the criteria that you need a car, then you need a car here, and that does not make this site sustainable. It is not possible to walk it. Take it from someone who knows this area extremely, extremely well. So I really do have great difficulty in accepting this. In fact, I believe that we cannot accept this for the reasons I've just given. I think it contravenes local plan policies DM5, actually. It's not in line with that, or with SS1. It's certainly not in line with policies PW2, and in particular, Objective 12 of the neighbourhood plan. This application is not sustainable, believe me, and in addition would create a loss of employment. And to be fair, Staplehurst has got 700 houses, some of them already being built, so we're not exactly NIMBYs in this position, we're the reverse of it, and we don't need these extra houses. It's not needed when you need to protect our employment, and I believe we should refuse this application. Thank you for being so patient with me, Chairman.
Well, you're going to have to go on a little longer, I'm afraid, because for those of us who are not familiar, which will certainly be some of us with the details of the Staplehurst Neighbourhood Plan policies, I would like to ask you, as I'm sure you are familiar with them, to actually give us the wording, if you have it. Looking that up, so I will return to you in due course. Whilst you're looking that up, I will take Councillor Harwood.
Thank you, Chairman. I have a lot of sympathy with local residents' concern about the loss of a small employment site. I mean, funnily enough, at a pre-meeting we were attending just earlier, I was bemoaning the fact that my ward, which was essentially with Tovel, the industrial heart of Maidstone, now has no employment sites. They've all been asset stripped for housing. And that has meant that we now get out commuting to work, which has caused all sorts of problems in terms of danger and pollution and so on. So, but the problem is that with the government so determined to deliver additional housing, I cannot see Sajid Javid's department upholding a refusal on a brownfield site such as this, particularly when you look at the regulatory framework in terms of local plan and national planning policy. So that brings us on to the Balancing Act. And I think actually, in terms of the conversion elements on this scheme, in terms of the new build, it's really pretty good with the urgent update and the tweaks to landscaping and some of the detail. I don't believe that it's a sustainable site for employment or for residential, because it still generates trips. The problem is that in policy terms, there is no objection from the Highway Authority, so therefore there is no ground for refusal that we can use, because essentially it's neutral. We've got trips generated by employment or we've got trips generated by residential. So again, there is no ground for refusal whatsoever. Then I come on at looking at the fine grain of the detail. I think it's really, really important because this is, if you like, a farm building kind of settlement, and it is surrounded by some very open countryside. So therefore, the boundary buffers are really important if we are to avoid all of the domestic paraphernalia problems that were talked about earlier on, about the lit-up conservatories and the 4x4s parked all over the garden and all the problems that we've got legion across our borough. And the way that we safeguard that, I think, is the fact that you've got buffer strips built into this site for ecological reasons. However, what we've seen all around the borough, and certainly in my ward, is that ancient woodland buffers and ecological buffers last for a little while until they get sold to the householder who wants to build an extension and therefore wants to extend the garden or various other reasons, and they suddenly get eaten up and they therefore no longer function. So my question to the planners is how can the buffer strip, particularly the one adjacent to the pond on the neighbouring plot, how can we ensure that it survives into the long term? I know that it can't be perpetuity because the houses won't be there for perpetuity, but how can we ensure long-term survival? Because it isn't a big site, and I can't see a LEMP attached to it, but I just want a condition or a device to do that. If I'm satisfied with that, I am happy to, for brevity's sake, that we move. That we grant permission as per the papers and the urgent update to approve, but I do want some satisfaction on how we preserve those boundary buffers because they're so important from a number of perspectives.
Well, it's a very clear question, Mr. Bailey. Mr. Ryan, are you able to help us with that? Because it is important, because as Councillor Harwood says, they do tend to disappear if they're not safeguarded.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose in terms of what we potentially could do. Obviously, we don't know land ownership of those individual sites. What we could do is frame a condition to the effect that that buffer strip comes out of an individual ownership of any property, and you put it as some form of communal area of land, which is some kind of strategic area of landscaping land. And on that basis, because it wouldn't fall in the ownership of any one property, it would obviously be owned by, I presume, all of them, and they would have to maintain it on that basis. And that would give some longevity to that, because there would be no particular one owner who would have control. It would have to be sort of the group. And that's quite common practice on larger schemes, and I don't see why that wouldn't work on a scheme like this. So if members were to find that satisfactory, I would request that I'd get delegated authority to draft and frame a condition on that basis to take it out of individual ownership and some kind of communal landscape buffer strip on that side.
Councillor Harwood, is that enough? Sorry, the legal officer wants to check.
If the committee is... Sorry, you're not on. I'm not on.
If the committee is minded to give that delegated authority, I would request that it be delegated authority for either a condition or a section 106 so that officers can determine the appropriate method to take it forward. Thank you.
Very helpful. Councillor Harwood.
Thank you, Chairman. That's helpful. In fact, we used a similar approach, you may recall, at Grafty Green Garden Centre for the strip adjacent to that along Crumps Lane. So that would potentially work, because there is another issue here around if that buffer is going to operate in the long term, there will need to be an element of maintenance every now and again so it doesn't become completely overgrown or whatever, and so that you don't get issues around complaint. It needs to be a mosaic of vegetation types. So potentially we need to think about where the access to the buffer strip will come from to allow incremental or maintenance as and when required. So with that delegated additional condition or section 106 head, I am willing to move that we grant permission as with the updated, with the urgent update. Thank you.
Is that seconded? Councillor Cox, do you wish to speak now?
I do. I wish to ask a question. The entrance area as well is shown in brown on this. Is that a communal space, and would that be linked to this for maintenance purposes as well? Because it doesn't seem to be any one particular properties, yet it's going around to the south where Councillor Harwood has said the buffer should remain. Is that a similar sort of case?
Chairman? Yes, all right. In terms of, I think that could come under, what I'd frame it as, I'd frame it under details of communal areas shown on the site, which shall include, and we can do I presume that's the eastern boundary site, and we could do the northern areas of the site, which obviously don't fall within the ownership of the individual plot owners. So we can actually include that within the wording of the conditional section 106 and to encompass that. You are correct. I think that's an important when you approach onto the site. So it's something we can include into the wording, yes.
In which case, Mr. Chairman, yes, I'm happy to second.
Thank you. Right. Are you indicating, Mr. Spooner, Councillor Spooner?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before coming here this evening, I looked at the site this morning and I read the committee report and the objections, and I was minded to support the officers, and I think I still am. At the end of the day, this is a brownfield site. You know, there is development there. It has permitted development rights which can be exploited. We're looking at protecting the countryside. So at the end of the day, it comes down to a choice of whether you're going to stay with the industry, which might create all sorts of traffic movements in terms of vans, lorries, HGVs, or you have a well-designed housing scheme. And that is what it boils down to. I must admit I'm coming round to thinking that the houses will be better. I understand and I can see where the parish council are coming from. It's not in their neighbourhood plan. I have every sympathy with that. But the fact of the matter is, it's in the countryside and it is there. And we as a planning authority have got to decide what's going to happen to it. Does it stay as it is, or do we try to improve it environmentally? And I think that is the issues that we need to decide. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Spooner. I did promise to come back to you, Councillor Perry, after you did some research, and I will take you shortly. I will simply observe that as a long-term resident of Tovel, I've lived next to sites that were local employment sites for a very long time and which have become housing sites. The general trend, and the objector quite rightly raised a number of issues, but in general my experience of a conversion from industrial, light industrial or other sites to residential is that the volume of traffic falls fairly consistently. So I think that is likely to happen here. There is no guarantee, of course, but it is likely. So it would be difficult to sustain an argument on traffic grounds. Similarly, it's a brownfield site, so a countryside argument is difficult. So it all comes down to, in my view, whether the Staplehurst Neighbourhood Plan specifically protects this site as opposed to shall we say, a general support for business development and retention in Staplehurst. So does it specifically protect this exact site, Councillor Berry?
Thank you, Chairman. I suppose it depends how you interpret the neighbourhood plan, isn't it? And the English language is infinite in its richness and can be interpreted various ways. Yeah, sure. But before I do, I want to ask a question, because it's quite important. It's about sustainability. Yeah, okay. Well, there's two issues on the neighbourhood plan. There's Objective 12, which is about... I've completely lost it. Hold on a second. I'll read out policy PW2, because it's probably easier, isn't it, to do? Yeah. There's two parts to this, and this is why I wanted to... Proposals for new development in the countryside beyond the extended village envelope will be assessed in terms of the potential impact of the development upon the visual setting and landscape features of the site and its surroundings, the potential impact upon the biodiversity of the area and other relevant planning considerations, such as the impact of traffic and noise. Proposals which fail to demonstrate these impacts can be satisfactorily addressed will not be supported. Now, the other paragraph, which is important, which follows it immediately, says, the neighbourhood plan strongly supports protection of the wider countryside outside the areas identified for new development. So that's, and that's the village envelope argument there. So there is therefore a presumption against the development of any land. I'm trying to, it's sort of reading is quite small, other than those sites identified as suitable for development within the neighbourhood plan. So if it's outside, basically it's a no-no. I'm trying to find objective 12, which is about, that is specifically about supporting and sustaining economic development and business in the area. So,
okay,
I've lost the plot on that one, but I'm trying to find. I had it and I've lost it.
Okay, thank you for that. We'll come back to sustainability in a second. Okay, what I suspected is the case. We can argue about precedents of various plans, but looking at PW2, this is a countryside protection policy, and if this was a new development, I think it would carry some weight. But this is a brownfield site, so we're talking about moving from one form of development to the other, so it isn't really. So, regrettably, I don't think it carries much weight. In terms of Objective 12, well, it's not a policy, but it's still relevant, but it isn't site-specific. So I'm not saying it doesn't carry any weight. I wouldn't want to say that. But it isn't like saying, unless you found a specific reference to this site. So if you could read out Objective 12.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I will do. Yeah, I found it. Thank goodness. Support for a strong local economy with good access to jobs and employment opportunities, which you know, is okay, I agree it's general, but it is quite important because there are 6 businesses operating on this site, and they're being swapped for a housing development.
Thank you.
That's what it's about.
We'll rest that point at this moment. Now, the sustainability point, Councillor Perry, before you address that, can I ask you a very straightforward question? Yes. How far, and we'll worry about the safety of the road in a minute, but how far are the nearest bus stops to this location? Where are they, roughly?
I honestly can't tell you because I've driven it so many times. And
okay.
I think I'd be wrong if I...
Okay. Okay, thank you. Okay. Okay. Okay, thank you very much.
It's up Prissing Lane, so it's quite a way up, you know. It's a really long walk, I'll tell you.
Now, now, very briefly, because I think we're reaching the end of this discussion. If you wish to address anything further on the sustainability point, I'll give you about a minute and a half to.
I don't need that actually, Chairman. It's just I'm referring to policy DM5 in the local plan. I'm sorry, yeah, I should have known by now, shouldn't I? It's policy DM5 in the local plan, and it's it's point 2 really, and it's right at the end where it says that it's and the site is or can reasonably be made accessible by sustainable modes to a Maidstone urban area. Well, it can't be, because the only option you've got is a car. You're not getting anywhere else. You try going by bus, you won't make it. Particularly the infamous number 5, you'd probably be all day waiting for it anyway. So it's not sustainable on those grounds. And yet, what I was saying, that previously we refused, site for the same reason. Sorry, that's it.
That's fine, Councillor Perry. The point, I think you've made the point quite well. I'll ask Mr. Bailey or Mr. Ryan, whichever, to just address the final issues from their point of view, and then we'll proceed to wrap. I'm sorry you can't.
I'll just draw members' attention to 604 paragraphs. I think that was the paragraph you were looking for in terms of the bus stop. It sets out 1.2 miles to the nearest bus stop. I mean, in terms of the preamble to policy DM5, and draw members' attention to 6.37 of the report, there is an acknowledgement in that the brownfield sites that have come forward in the urban area, they're also in the countryside. So there is an inherent acknowledgement that there are sites in the countryside that the council needs to look at to come forward, and as long as they're not environmentally sensitive and it results in a significant improvement and enhancement to the site, then you are in compliance with policy. So to my mind, and I think we've gone through the issues of the employment site, we've said that the site isn't actually protected under the local plan. So there isn't a policy that actually protects this site in the local plan for employment purposes. So there wouldn't be able to be a sustainable ground on retention of employment use. So then you're really looking at the key definitive issues are, is the design, is the layout, is the landscaping acceptable to allow this site to be developed for residential? I think those are the key issues. I agree. In terms of Councillor Perry, the neighbourhood plan is an important issue. However, the policy PW2 is not a restraint. It doesn't say development will not be allowed in the countryside. It effectively assesses them in a similar fashion as SP17 does. So where there's harm identified, then you then kick it. Then it would then sort of apply that principle. But in terms of the basis, unless you've identified clear harm arising from the development of this site, it's not contrary to PW2. So again, I think on that basis, if members were going to say it's contrary, you'd need to very clearly say, why is it contrary to PW2 of the Staplehurst plan? Because please identify the harm to me, and then we can have a discussion on that point. So then you then go to DM5. That, in principle, supports the development as long as it meets those criteria. And obviously, I think you'll see from the photographs of the site and the significant improvements that arise from that, then obviously in the judgment of officers we consider that it does. It retains a non-designated heritage asset. Again, that's an important consideration. You must weigh in the balance of the consideration. It reuses that building. Yes, it builds new buildings on the site, but look at the extensive area of car parking already on the site. So I think, again, as I said, I go back to the balance issue that members need to consider. And again, you need to consider, in terms of sustainability, look at the businesses that are already on the site. And I've heard the argument quite a few times. I consider that would be a reduction in traffic issues on the site, but also you've got to consider people are going to that site for employment purposes already. So it is an important consideration that members would need to consider currently existing use and what's coming forward. And I think I will finish on my summary there.
Thank you. Councillor Mumford, you haven't spoken, so I will take you.
Just very quickly, it's not an allocated employment site. It's a brownfield site. SP17 is for the open countryside, and it appears that PW2 is for the open countryside. And I listened to Mr. Bailey, and the only reason I'm speaking is because we're balancing things, and the one thing that we have not discussed, and I think it's quite minor, but we mustn't avoid it, is the site at the moment provides people with employment, and we're removing that. Now, I'm in mind to vote for the officer's recommendation, but I just can't sit here and not consider that fact.
Councillor Round, I will take you as I haven't spoken before. But
I certainly think that Councillor Mumford has made a very important point. So I've actually been looking through the update and actually trying to read between the lines of the large part of the additional representation, where it says that as part of the long process of adopting the local plan, sites will have included the north of Staplehurst Rural Service Centre on Honeycrest Industrial Park, and that the Council's Economic Development Team have indicated that there is additional capacity. So I, like so many people here, are really trying to weigh things up one way or another. I mean, that sort of debate was started by Councillor Harwood. In fact, it is a very finite balancing act we have here. There are so many pros and there's so many cons. And there are various things that do weigh, and how much weight you give those is up to one's individual. But I take Councillor Mumford's point. I really do think it's a very valid point that there are units available in the north of Staplehurst. And if the Council's economic development team can really confirm that there will be loan funding to support businesses who may relocate, 5-6 miles, then I think that's probably a swinger for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Rand. I am moving to a conclusion now, but I will very quickly take your final point, Councillor Perry.
Yes, well, the employment, of course, assumes that those businesses will stay in the rural area, and we need to keep businesses in the rural area. But I agree. I realise that that's an argument we could debate all night about. What I wanted to come back, and I understand where Ms Bailey come from. You always make a very good argument. But I'm still coming back to this point in DM5, which basically says, and the site is or can reasonably be made accessible by sustainable modes. Now, we're talking about the houses here. We're talking about the people living in the houses. We're not talking about the businesses in this particular instance. It is not sustainable. I'm sorry. You wouldn't survive the journey to the bus stop if you had to do it on a daily basis. Believe me, the road is really, really dangerous to walk on. So I think DM5 is not in line with it, and that's the reason why I'm very, very concerned about it.
I take your point, Councillor Perry, and to be honest, if this was a new application, I think we could actually probably refuse it on those grounds, but it isn't. I'm sorry, members of the public can't add anything. No, I'm sorry, I would be breaking the law if I took your comments now. I'm sorry, I do apologise for that. And the problem is it's not a new application. It has to be measured against what is there now. I'm going to move to the vote now on the motion as somewhat tweaked. Is everyone aware of the tweaking? Did you want to repeat it, Councillor Harwood? Just so
Thank you, Chairman. It is the recommendation as per the papers and the urgent update, with the addition of delegated powers to officers to negotiate either a Section 106 head of terms or condition, whichever is most appropriate, to ensure that the buffer areas, mostly the kind of brown hatched areas on the plan, are kept out, a management company or some way that they're not owned by a single householder, and to enable their long-term maintenance to benefit biodiversity and landscape, which will require access to them and the final design to accommodate that access. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Harwood. That's very clear. Those in favour of the motion proposed? Those against? Any abstentions? I don't think so. Thank you. So we move back to the order paper. Yes, that is carried. We move back to the order paper. Now, I think item 4, and I will stand to be corrected by Councillor Mumford or whoever, is actually not Staplehurst, but it's actually Chart Sutton. And I understand that the Parish Council, with the updated officer's report, have withdrawn their objection. Therefore, I am not going to ask for a discussion on this unless members really wish to discuss it. Councillor Mumford, it's your ward. Are you wanting this report introduced? No, in that case, I'll just check whether there's an urgent update on this. I don't believe so. No, in that case, can I take any declarations of lobbying? Councillor Mumford, of course. In that case, I shall move the recommendation on the papers. Those in favour? Sorry, Councillor Cox is second. Yes. Sorry, item 13.
Item 13.
Yeah. I just want to get rid of that one. Yeah, item 13, yeah. Now we will then move to item... I'm just getting rid of them. I'm just getting rid of the one that didn't have any speakers.
Yeah, we haven't voted on that one yet.
Yes, we have. Yeah.
I haven't seen that, Chairman.
Sorry?
I haven't seen that vote.
We take that vote again. Item 13, the Sharp Sutton. Right? The Parish Council withdrawn their objection. Move into the vote on that.
This is to grant.
Consent, yes.
Could you members just lift their hands up a bit higher?
Yeah.
That's okay.
Just want to get rid of that. Where I don't imagine... I'll get rid of the other item, which I don't think there's going to be any discussion in a minute. But any against? Any against? I think that was everyone, so I didn't think there was... Oh, sorry, there was an abstention. Abstentions? It's abstentions. Yeah, 3 abstentions. That application is granted. I'm going to get rid of the other one, which I don't think there'll be any speakers on, if there aren't any speakers, which is item 17 on page 47. Yes, I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Item 17, land at Lodge Close to Street, Oldcombe, Kent. Does anyone wish to have that report introduced or wish to speak to it? In that case, I move the recommendation. All those in favour?
Mrs. Stockwell, are you voting?
Thank you. That's everyone, so no further votes. Right. I see that Mrs. Moore and partner, I think, are still here. I don't know whether you're aware, whether you're just fascinated by the discussion, but the application was granted. I'm not sure. If you wish to stay, by all means do, but there's no further discussion on that. Yes, and we are not going to get into that discussion because I know you feel strongly, but that is not allowed. Councillor Harwood.
Sorry, just if we're moving on to item 18 as well, I just needed to declare that I'm a member of Boxley Parish Council. Are we? No, move the recommendation. It's a very tidy site.
But you already have.
Yeah, I already have to. Yeah. In relation to item 6, on the Valley Park Community School site, I'm a member of Boxley Parish Council, but I took no part in any discussion and therefore intend to spoke and vote. But I hope we don't have to, and we move straight to the vote, Chairman.
Before we do that, may I take declarations of lobbying? Me too. I think that's everyone. Right. And there is an urgent update report. Now, before this meeting, I was told that Mr. Councillor Goff of Kent County Council wished to come and speak this evening. I was in two minds about that, and I was actually because that would have been a departure from rules, but I was eventually persuaded I would put that to the committee if he arrived, as you can see, so that point becomes moot, because he isn't here. The Cabinet Member for Education at Kent County Council. But he's probably got stuck in a traffic jam or something. Councillor Perry, was it on this particular point?
Yeah, I was going to ask a favour, really, of the committee, whether we could just defer this for the next meeting. Because it's such a serious issue, and I think you need, we need the people here to...
It's not a serious issue.
Well, it is for other people. You can't make that comment, Chairman.
Well...
I'm sorry, you know, it is... I believe it... I'm only the messenger, so don't shoot the messenger, but I understand this is a very serious issue for some people. And I think as the committee is going to do justice, we should be allowed to debate. It's only 2 weeks, I think.
We can't. The reason I'm saying we can't is not because I don't want... And I did ask the officers specifically, because of our conversation before the meeting, whether we could defer it. And I was minded so to do, until I found out that the TPO expires on the 5th of April, which is actually our next committee date, and which means it will be too late. And the TPO would automatically expire, which means that we can't defer it. We have to make a decision, because otherwise the decision is made by the deferral. Do you see what I'm saying, Councillor Perry? That's the only reason I'm not minded to move for a deferral, because we can't. And unfortunately or otherwise, our appeal position would be seriously invalidated, would be seriously undermined by the lapsing of the TPO at this point. Councillor Harwood.
Thank you, Chairman. Just also as background, we know the history to this. This application was appealed by the applicant 2 or 3 days before it, less than that. Yeah, about a day and a half before it was due to go to committee with an officer recommendation of approval, and it would have been permitted. So that, if there were a TPO, if there were grants of permission, that would have overridden the tree preservation order. However, the tree preservation order is important to ensure good design and that the whole lot isn't bulldozed out.
I have to stop you at this point, Councillor Harwood, because the only reason we were addressing anything is because we were not going to have the discussion if there was going to be a deferral. Yeah. We cannot get into the discussion of the meat of the issue until after the officer's introduction. No, well, I don't think we can, given the position that Councillor Perry has, and I think we do need the officer to introduce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I mean, I'll be relatively brief, because I think members of the committee, the application came to committee twice. Councillor Hiles had set out a few issues. You've got in front of you the officer's report, and I'll draw your attention to the urgent update report. We have had a representation from the planning agent regarding the site who's objecting to the confirmation of the order. I think the officer's report is very clear in terms of how it sets out their concerns and objections, because they do it on a bullet point, and I think it's very clear to follow. I would just add on the basis, in terms of the reasons why the first order was let to lapse, because that was on a basis that was done on a group order, because we had reason to believe that trees were proposing to be removed, and we didn't have the assurance on the site that none of the trees would be removed before planning decision was made. So we let the first order lapse on the basis that it was an emergency group TPO order. We then reserved this order on the basis that it wasn't appropriate to progress with that one because that was an emergency, and we've re-studied this issue and re-looked at the trees, taken account of some of the concerns of the applicant. So I think on that basis, we've been pragmatic. We are entering into an appeal process. We have been discussing with the applicant in terms of our way forward. We have come up solutions and given solutions to the applicant in terms of how it can address some of their concerns. One of the key concerns being, if development were to be granted by the Planning Inspectorate, the issues of nesting birds. And we have come up with ideas that the applicant can do to address this, but they don't seem to want to follow the advice that we're giving. So on that basis, I would recommend to members that this application, the TPO is confirmed without modification on that basis, because we are heading into an appeal process. As I said, this order doesn't stop an application coming forward, or notwithstanding that, if the appeal is successful, then those trees effectively would come out because the planning permission would override the TPO. So, in effect, this TPO is acting as a temporary measure until such time as whatever decision comes forward from the planning inspectorate. And I hope that's clear to members, so my recommendation is we confirm without modification.
Yes, I'd like to second everything that Mr. Bailey's just said. The other point from a legal perspective is that the decision that this committee took to state that it would have been minded to approve was done with the status quo being that the TPO was in place. If this committee decided to not put a TPO in place at that time, an inference would be drawn from that at the inquiry. And therefore, I think the assumption would be that the playing field, the status quo, would be the same for the inspector. So that should also be considered by the committee.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Councillor Harwood, sorry to stop you earlier.
No, thank you, Chairman. I think it's helpful this is reintroduced, and I want to just make several points. One is that local residents are expecting to speak at the public inquiry in May in relation to this site, and therefore I think we would be short-circuiting the democratic process. Boxley Parish Council are also scheduled to speak at that public inquiry, as indeed am I. Going to speak at that public inquiry, and the submissions have already been put in, because actually it is this historic, indeed medieval park boundary which is the issue at stake. It is not the principle of the school. So that's a critical issue. And I come back to the point that these trees are ancient trees. They are huge trees which are already massive in Humphrey Repton's drawings from the 1790s. And the large stag-headed oak, which is at the centre of the access, which is part of this TPO group, it already has lesser spotted woodpeckers nesting within holes within the stag-headed. So they are already nesting, so they could not mess about with these trees until that red-listed species stops being inside the tree. They would also need to carry out the surveys for bats and so on because of the hollows in this stag-headed tree. So it is not. So the 1981 Wildlife and Countryside Act is primary legislation, and it would trump TPO law in any case. So there is another consideration that needs to be taken into account here. With all that said, in May there will be a decision one way or other from the inspector. It could have all been decided months ago, but the applicant decided to take this path for whatever reason, and it has left a lot of uncertainty for a lot of residents. But we will get there in the end, and we as a committee, I think, should respect due process. And therefore, I'd like to move that we do confirm the order. Thank you.
Is that seconded? Councillor Cox, would you like to speak now?
No, I don't think I need to. I think it's all been said, but definitely want a second.
Yeah, I'll come to you in a second, Councillor Spooner. I think it's a fairly clear issue. I mean, there is, despite the representations being made, there is not likely to be any greater delay caused by this, by confirming the TPO. And in any case, even if the TPO is confirmed, then an application for works could still be made at any time under that. It doesn't stop any such application. And thirdly, frankly, if there hadn't been an appeal process, all of this would have been done by now, but given that there is an appeal process, this council does need to take account of not undermining its own position in said appeal, regardless of what other arguments may or may not be made. So I will support confirming the TPO. I now move to Councillor Round, who indicated previously.
I think this is one of, well, it happens probably every planning application and every planning committee, but this is one of these applications that so often we are tortured as members of the planning committee between our heads, our hearts, our conscience, and some of our own personal as well as perceptive beliefs of what we think is good or bad and the way we balance it out. I mean, ultimately, it is a choice of whether we do wait for a long process to happen or whether we actually choose to say a few trees today versus definitely building a school. It's one or the other, or a waiting game. And I think we're all torn between our head and our heart on it.
I wasn't going to come back, but the idea that confirming this TPO will prevent the school being built is not true. It would simply require the school to actually talk to us as a planning authority, which is something the school themselves actually have not refused to do, but their agent has basically refused to do. So it would not prevent this school being built. And if they had not taken this route for the appeal, it would have already been under construction and would be looking to open soon. So I entirely resist the suggestion that there is a great issue here. There is an issue here in that, for whatever reason, this applicant has chosen to do what very few applicants have ever done, and that is appeal less than 36 hours before a recommendation for approval was on the papers, because they weren't prepared to accept any conditions, which is even more bizarre. They could simply have appealed against the conditions one by one, which is what other people would normally have done. Councillor Spooner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support the making of this preservation order. I have to say that we've already seen the sort of cavalier attitude of the agents. One could almost describe them as being irresponsible the way they behave. And I think that anything that can strengthen our officers' hand in securing adequate landscaping and a good scheme on this site is to be very much supported. And that's all I would like to say. Thank you.
Councillor, Mr. Bailey, you did want to very briefly come back, and I do mean briefly.
Yeah. Thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to sort of pick up on the Councillor Round point. I did say earlier in the presentation that obviously if permission were to be granted, then what happens is that the planning permission, I don't like to use the word, would in effect trump the TPO, aside from what Councillor Harwood says about the Wildlife and Countryside Act issue. So obviously that would need to be taken into account. But notwithstanding that, if permission is granted by the Inspectorate, it is clear that that would allow said trees to be removed as set out on the plan, because it would override it. So that is the fact, aside from what Councillor Harwood has said, which is totally correct. Just to be clear.
Yes, just to please focus the committee's mind before a decision is taken here. This is a TPO application. A previous TPO was in place, and we are considering here a TPO. It is proper for the committee to have regard to changing the playing field that might appear at the public inquiry and an inference that would be drawn from that. Wider considerations probably should not enter into the committee's decision-making process at this point. So I would urge the committee, please, to consider this TPO on its merits. Thank you.
And I'm sure we will all do so. But thank you very much for the reminder. Councillor Perry, I wasn't sure you were indicating to actually speak in the debate or not. Thank you. Right, I think that is everyone who... Oh, sorry, you reserved your right, Councillor Cox. Did you wish to? Okay, then in that case, we will move to the vote on... And it's been proposed and seconded that we do reconfirm the order. Those in favour? Those against? Abstentions? 3 abstentions. Thank you, members. Right. I don't think there's anything else other than a brief look at the appeal decisions, which are interesting. Another good set of decisions by the Inspectorate. Congratulations to all concerned.
Chairman, if I come in, I mean, especially in relation to number 5 in Butland Hill, which would have significantly changed a part of the town where we've developed local guidance as well, and I think it's well fought and well won.
Yes, excellent job by all concerned. Councillor Mumford, you're looking like you want to say something. Yeah, I was going to say, on the Chairman's announcements, we did have I think, quite productive meeting of Chairman, Vice Chairman, and political group spokespersons on a number of subjects, and hopefully you will see feedback from your various group spokespersons on that in due course, if you haven't had it already. But one of those discussions was on moving forward with the issue of the enforcement protocols and enforcement matrices, which is obviously a matter of great importance to this committee and other members of the council. Councillor Mumford. And
just for the clarity of the minutes when they come out, I didn't dispute it when you said it. Chart Sutton have not removed their objections. They called it in. They would have, after reading the officer's report, removed their call-in. Yeah, it's just I've got to face the public and that parish
That's a
council.
very important clarification. Thank you very much. Councillor Round, you get the last word.
I did say it at the chairs and spokespersons meeting, but I will repeat it because I think it genuinely needs to be repeated, not just as a spokesperson's minute, but I think it needs to be declared as a planning committee minute, that I think Chair and I, Vice Chair and the spokesperson have actually enjoyed. Okay, it's been a difficult planning year, but I think we're getting close to the end of it. We've actually enjoyed a very, very beneficial relationship between us all of different political groupings and indeed with the officers. And I think we can actually say that from the spokespersons and chairs group, it has been a very positive year, and that is not only worthy of congratulating the members that attend, Mr Mumford, etc., but also the officers. The officers have been particularly good at grasping things and taking things forward, and I think we have made some excellent progress, and I would like that to be recorded in a planning committee minute.
Thank you. That's very nice to hear. Right, unless anyone else has any points on this particular item or anything that needs further consideration, I declare this meeting closed. The Ides of March have been survived, so far anyway, with no one assassinated.